This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dorivar Ruiz Diaz, K-State Nutrient Management Specialist, begins today's show discussing how to identify nutrient deficiency in soybeans. There are multiple reasons that producers could be seeing this in their fields. Keeping the show going is K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster with information about Palmer Amaranth and Kochia. She reviews how these weeds can be managed by producers. K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, concludes today's show. He says temperatures have not been optimal for tomatoes and that tomato growers may be noticing that their otherwise healthy plants are failing to produce fruit. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show talking about identifying nutrient deficiency. And then to talk about that, we have K-State Nutrient Management Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. Dorivar, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
There's many reasons that you might see leaf discoloration or parts in the fields, and one of those is nutrient deficiencies. And however, there are different classifications of nutrients.
Yes, and again, this is the time of the year where we start to see some issues maybe in some fields, maybe parts of the field. And like you mentioned, some of that could be nutrient deficiencies. Obviously, could be other issues as well, but oftentimes tend to be nutrient-related. And we're talking about soybean, but obviously the same thing will happen to corn. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind in terms of first trying to identify the issue, if we are thinking it's a nutrient issue, there are really some guidelines that we need to keep in mind for the type of visual symptoms that we're seeing and what could be the potential nutrient causing the problem. And one of the things that is always important to understand is the mobility of the nutrient within the plant, which is oftentimes different than the mobility that you have in the soil. But if you keep in mind that typically the mobile nutrients within the plant is going to show deficiency symptoms in the lower leaves, then that narrow basically already the potential issues in terms of nutrients. And so, again, basically the mobile nutrients will be within the plant. It's going to be moving those nutrients to the growing parts of the plant, the newer leaves, and then you have the yellowing happening basically in the lower leaves. And the typical example of that is nitrogen, right, that we tend to see in corn very often, but we can also see it in soybean if you don't have good nodulation happening. And that discoloration, chlorosis will be usually in the lower leaves. Other nutrients that are also mobile in the plant is going to be phosphorus, potassium, magnesium. And again, these will often show up that chlorosis happening in the lower leaves. Now, the rest of other nutrients, and especially the micronutrients, are basically immobile in the plant, which basically means that oftentimes that yellowing is going to be in the younger, newer leaves, right? And so if you're thinking about things like iron chlorosis, right, those are often situations that we see, especially in high pH in western Kansas. We tend to see deficiency symptoms, again, chlorosis happening in the very young leaves, in the upper leaves, again, because these are not mobile within the plant. Basically, the plant is not able to translocate the nutrients within the plant. So that's a first easy way to usually kind of identify and narrow down what are the potential issues that we're seeing in the field, of course, after we are considering that we are really dealing with a nutrient deficiency issue.
And there are many reasons that you could have nutrient deficiency in your field.
Yes, and that's the next step, right? Once we identify that we do have a problem, let's say, for example, an issue related to micronutrients or perhaps a phosphorus deficiency happening, then the question is, why do we see that, right? And what is the problem in that field? Sometimes it's just parts of the field. Sometimes can be the entire field, and obviously the first thing that we're thinking is that there's low nutrient content in the soil to begin with, right? And so how do we know that? How we confirm that is basically with soil tests. Hopefully we are already have some soil test information, or that may be an indication that we need to do some more soil test analysis, if possible, during the growing season. But in this case, in many cases, maybe already, by the end of the season, and really figure out what the problem is and what is the level in the soil. But there are also other issues that may be causing nutrient deficiency to show up in soybean and other crops. One of those is, for example, pH. Also going back to the soil, it's not really the level of the nutrient, but it's really conditions of pH that maybe we are dealing with acidic soil, for example, where we have aluminum toxicity. This is a situation where the root development is really basically affected significantly in the plant, and so we have very short roots because of that low pH, which in turn, obviously, the plant is not able to take up the nutrients. Oftentimes, that also means that they are not taking up water because of that low pH problem. And again, soybean is a legume; it can be very sensitive to that. Another thing that can be affected also in the case of soybean is just poor nodulation. Oftentimes, that goes along with pH as well. If you don't have a good pH range, sometimes nodulation is affected. That obviously is going to cause some nitrogen deficiency. And oftentimes it's just physical characteristic of that soil, right? We have maybe some compaction problems, fertility problems. There's no fertility issues in terms of nutrient supply, but again, because of that compaction, we don't have good root development and basically poor access to the nutrients. That's often the case for things like potassium. We often see potassium deficiency that tends to be due to issues of compaction, especially in soybeans.
And do these nutrient deficiency symptoms look a little bit different depending on what the nutrient is?
Yes, and that's where we need to be more specific, right? Sometimes it's in the case of mobile nutrients like nitrogen and potassium, they can kind of look alike a little bit, right? They are developing in same parts of the plant, but again, there are some small differences that we need to identify more closely. And oftentimes, we really need to go to next step, which really will be a plant analysis, right? A tissue analysis to really fine-tune and understand what are the problems. Sometimes it could be more than one nutrient issue, right? And we are not able to identify that just with the symptoms, the visual symptoms, but we really need to do that tissue analysis to know what the problem is.
And so we're really wanting to set up our crops as they continue to grow in the best circumstances possible.
And that's the question too, right? At this point, in the case of soybean, of course, we are a little bit early in the season still, more vegetative growth stage in most cases. So can we still do something about it, right? In some of these, once we identify this issue, can we do something about it? And in some cases, there is a potential to do, for example, some foliar applications in the case of micronutrients that maybe help us during this growing season. But in some cases, especially things like phosphorus and potassium, there's very little we can do this year because we are talking about a large amount of nutrients that we typically will tend to apply pre-plant and the application as essentially as a side dress at this point will make very little difference. And so depending on the situation, there may be a potential to make some corrective actions. In some cases, we really need to still identify what the problem is to be able to do something about it for next year so we don't run into the same problems.
So Dorivar, we're focused a little bit towards soybeans, but really something across all the crops, just getting things tested, maybe your soil, but also your plants if need be, to identify the issue.
Yes, and that's exactly right. This is not just for soybean, it's really for corn as well. And even though in the case of corn, we're already getting into reproductive stage at this point, we just mentioned tissue analysis still has a lot of value. Sometimes when we think about tissue analysis, there's really two main purposes, right? One of them is as a diagnostic to identify essentially what is the limiting nutrient in this case. And the second one is really more of as a quality control, if you will. Even though things are looking okay and seems to be in good shape, tissue analysis can tell us if we are maybe slightly lower in some nutrients and perhaps we need to make adjustments for next year. And so that is something that I will definitely encourage producers to think about this. The remaining of this season is to take opportunities for tissue analysis, especially, again, we're thinking about fine-tuning fertility programs for the future.
And for the future, if they're needing to fix those nutrient issues, is there a specific time of year that's the best time to do that?
Yes, and this is where, again, with the information on hand from tissue analysis, we can follow up with soil analysis after harvest. And typically that window of late fall and early spring, we may have the opportunity to fix issues if we're talking about especially macronutrients like P and K, where we may need to do higher application rates. Definitely needs to be done, again, late fall or early spring before next year. But again, we do need to have all of that information, both tissue and soil, before we make that decision.
Dorivar, we talked a lot about testing. And for producers who are wanting to do the tissue analysis, what are some guidelines that producers should follow through with?
That's an excellent question. And it is, in the case of tissue analysis, is particularly important because the way we interpret tissue tests is basically that we compare these values to essentially what we will consider to be normal concentrations in healthy plants. And again, that concentration can be different if we are collecting different plant parts. For example, if we are collecting the whole plant, or if we are collecting, in the case of soybean, for example, only the trifoliates. It's also going to be different depending on the growth stage. The optimum concentration of nutrient is different during the growing season of that crop. And so that means basically we need to follow guidelines in terms of specific growth stages and plant parts that we're going to be collecting. And so there are many things that we need to keep in mind here, and the most important thing is really to stay in communication with the lab that you're using. For example, if you're using the K-State Soil Testing Lab, try to communicate and understand what plants we need to collect, depending on the growth stage of the plant, so we are able to do that comparison to the right optimum values. In other words, we want to be able to compare here apples to apples, and we're not comparing concentrations that we expect to see, early in the season for something that is collected later on. And so again, that growth stage is important. Having that information, collecting the right plant part is also a key. And that information needs to be communicated to the lab so interpretations are done correctly.
Dorivar, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and talk about nutrient deficiency in soybeans.
Thank you.
That was K-State Nutrient Management Specialist Dorivar Ruiz Diaz. He has recently written some articles for an Agronomy e-update referencing these topics, which will be linked in today's show notes, as well as the K-State Soil Lab testing. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our conversation relating to crops, however, this time talking about controlling weeds this time of year. And then to talk about that, we have K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Thanks for having me.
And the first weed that you wanted to talk about today was Palmer Amaranth.
Palmer Amaranth keeps me in business, Shelby. So I think we should talk about it from a couple of perspectives today. The first one that I have probably most recently gotten a phone call and some questions on is related to Palmer Amaranth control in grain sorghum. So talking to folks at the CCA training event that we're doing here in Manhattan this week, and it sounds like there are still some folks planting grain sorghum actually in parts of the state, but a lot of our grain sorghum is up and growing well, and our pre-emergence herbicides that we used at planting have kind of done their thing and broken down or washed out of the profile, and so we're starting to see Palmer Amaranth come through grain sorghum and be a problem.
And is there a certain part of the state who's probably a little bit more concerned about this?
Our grain sorghum belt is kind of the center third of the state, or maybe the western 2/3 of the state. And so those folks are the ones that also have been getting more rainfall than normal here lately. And so those two things combined make this a really important topic because, again, thinking about our residual herbicides, they're designed to only last a certain period of time, but they also move down into the soil profile and out of the part of the soil where the weeds emerge from. And so we've got a couple of things working against us for folks trying to control Palmer Amaranth in grain sorghum right now.
So for those trying to control it, what are some resources that they may want to use?
The downside, Shelby, of controlling Palmer Amaranth in grain sorghum is just that there's not a lot of options. So if someone were to pick up a copy of the weed control guide and compare, for example, the list of herbicides labeled for corn to the list of herbicides labeled for grain sorghum, they would see that there's quite a discrepancy there. And we did write an e-update article that literally lists the products that are labeled for Palmer Amaranth control in grain sorghum. So as we think about herbicides that we should use, the list is not long. It starts with atrazine. So a lot of farmers are going to load up their residual herbicide program with some atrazine at the beginning of this season, either shortly before or about the time of planting. It's probably a good idea for folks to plan on saving some of their atrazine limits to help out with the post-emergence application. So most folks that are applying herbicides are probably aware that we do have rate limits on how much atrazine we can use, largely because of water quality concerns. So it's a good idea to save some of that atrazine for a post-emergence pass. So, just a quarter pound or half a pound of atrazine can help us out post-emergence. So that would be the first thing to think about. Another product that is an option would be AIM. The active ingredient there is carfentrazone. So AIM is a PPO inhibiting herbicide. So in order for it to be effective, we need good coverage. So that means small weeds, high spray volumes. One of the good things about AIM is that it can be tank mixed with a lot of different products. So by itself, AIM is not going to do a great job controlling Palmer, but it can be a good helper for some of the other products that we can consider.
You have a few more products then that can also be used, but once again, not an extensive list.
And quite frankly, Shelby, all of these have downsides too, right? AIM is going to give you some crop injury, not super effective. We talked about atrazine having the rate limits. The next products on the list are 2,4-D and dicamba. And so those products can give us good control of Palmer amaranth. However, sorghum is pretty responsive to 2,4-D and dicamba as well. And so in order to use the products safely on grain sorghum, we end up using practices that actually reduce the effectiveness of those herbicides. So for example, 2,4-D, we're limited on some of the adjuvants that we can use because we don't want to hurt the grain sorghum. So those adjuvants improve the weed control, but they also increase the crop response. So it's a trade-off. And so this is where, 2,4-D can be mixed with a lot of other things as well. So I know that we have concocted some very interesting brews to try to manage Palmer in grain sorghum, and 2,4-D is generally one of those products, with the caveat that there probably will be some crop response there. And dicamba is similarly, it can be tank mixed with quite a few things, but also going to have the crop response as well. And I think, as we think about 2,4-D, dicamba, even AIM, the crop response is going to be worse this time of year than it would be earlier in the growing season. Hot, humid conditions are generally associated with more crop response there for those products.
And overall, a lot of these products, when you read through that agronomy update, are likely going to burn the sorghum just a little bit.
So the last two on the list are ones that really do burn. So we talked about AIM as causing crop response, and that usually ends up looking like small little dead spots on the leaf. Same thing can be true of bromoxynil, or Moxie is one of the trade names that we sometimes see for bromoxynil now. Old product, been around a while. One of the advantages of bromoxynil is that it does have a little bigger application window than some of the other options. So I'm not going to be 90+% control of large Palmer amaranth. Again, we have to have good coverage, small weeds if we want to get decent control. Now, bromoxynil is also a component of Husky. So Husky is a fairly popular post-emergence product for weed control in grain sorghum. It will cause a foliar response, a little kind of dead spot in the leaf where the plant gets sprayed. It does need that atrazine, so we talked about saving that atrazine, so the atrazine will enhance the performance there. The other thing to think about with Husky is that it does have some kind of unique adjuvant requirements. So we need either an HSOC, so a surfactant and a crop oil combination, or you want to think about AMS plus a non-ionic surfactant, so the two pieces there. It can be tank mixed with 2,4-D or dicamba as well to kind of improve the effectiveness there. But Shelby, like we said at the outset, there are not a lot of options. This is not a long list of products can be used for post-emergence control of Palmer amaranth in grain sorghum. So guys really need to be scouting early and often and make sure they have a really good residual program for their grain sorghum at planting.
And one more weed to talk about today that is important is kochia.
Yeah, so kochia brings me to thinking about weed control and wheat stubble. So driving around the western parts of the state in recent weeks, there are still some wheat fields that are yet to be harvested because of the rain, and most of those fields are full of kochia and Palmer amaranth. Those weeds are going to regrow after the combine moves through, and all of their friends that are hanging out in the soil seed bank are going to start to emerge. So being on top of weed control and wheat stubble is going to be super important for folks this year. Again, there are not a ton of products that are specifically labeled for weed control in fallow situations. We can kind of be clever about how we interpret labels and make that list a little bit longer, but a strict reading of the labels leaves us with a pretty short list. So we're thinking about things like paraquat is often used for weed control in wheat stubble because it can be very effective. There are some things to consider there in terms of the requirements to be legal for handlers and applicators, but it is a good product. It works better in a combination with a photosystem 2 inhibitor. So if you're in a corn sorghum situation, that would be atrazine. If you're in a soybean situation, you can use metribuzin and get a similar increase in control with that tank mix. So paraquat is one that's been used for a while. I've been hearing quite a few folks talk highly of Sharpen. So Sharpen is a contact herbicide that can control Palmer amaranth. It's good for kochia. It has just a smidgen of residual activity, so folks can take advantage of that if folks choose to use Sharpen instead of paraquat for contact weed control in their wheat. Things to think about when you're using Sharpen is that it really does need a methylated seed oil, an MSO, as well as an AMS product to get maximum control. And again, good spray coverage is really important there as well. One other thing to think about with Sharpen, we can use rates as low as 1 ounce and as high as 3 ounces, but as you go up that rate scale, the crop rotation windows get a lot bigger, Shelby. And so folks need to pay careful attention to what their rotation plans are, what rates they're going to use, and what are the organic matter and texture of their soil. Another product that has been around a while and we're seeing lots of use of is flumioxazin or Valor. This product is going to provide a longer period of weed control, typically doesn't require a lot of rainfall for activation, can be tank mixed with some other products to increase the spectrum of weed control or to enhance control of weeds. I think it's important to remember, just like with Sharpen, Valor and Valor types of products do require good coverage for good control of emerged weeds. The third product that is in that same kind of group would be a product called Reviton. And Reviton's going to look a lot like Sharpen. It was new to the market last year. We're starting to see more folks using it and becoming familiar with it. Again, going to be very similar to Sharpen, needs both the seed oil, the MSO, and the AMS. And the other thing about Reviton and Sharpen is that they don't provide great grass control. So if you're trying to clean up grassy weeds or volunteer wheat, you're going to need to put some glyphosate in with those two products. But yes, anything we can do to add some residual activity there, so products like Valor or the atrazine metribuzin to help us kind of get a longer period of weed control in our wheat stubble is going to be important, because I'm afraid that guys are going to have their work cut out for them to keep stubble fields clean as we go into the fall.
That was K-State Weed Management Specialist Sarah Lancaster. The two Agronomy E updates that she referenced in today's show will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Tomato growers across Kansas may be noticing that their otherwise healthy tomato plants are failing to produce fruit. The problem is heat tolerance. Tomatoes have an optimal temperature to fruit, and when daytime temperatures reach above 85 degrees Fahrenheit, K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone, says it interferes with pollination and can cause plants to abort flowers. Greg, a chance to talk today about tomatoes, and what are we seeing so far? I've heard kind of hit and miss in areas.
Yes, I think if you're a cherry tomato lover, you're doing all right, because those seem to be the most dependable as far as ripening up and setting fruit. But some of our slicing or maybe canning type of tomatoes, we get a little more anxious and want those to be coming on like the cherry tomatoes, but may take a little bit longer to get those to ripen up for us.
Normally it's about, 65 to 85 days to get to the harvesting stage?
Yeah, it depends on temperature, and we can't control that very easily in our gardens. So if the temperatures are right, let's keep the temperatures between 85 and 75, and things go very quickly and very well. But we don't stay in those temperatures, so we can have high day temperatures where we have issues. The ripening slows down, the setting of fruit, the pollen's not really viable for many of our varieties that we grow, and so you don't get any fruit development. And if it stays too cool, that also is a problem too. So we'll slow down the ripening or even again, the flowers won't be viable if it stays too cool morning temperatures anyway.
Is there a time when you really should start getting them off the vine?
I would say once you start to see some color, maybe half ripe or maybe even a little bit before that, they're mature. They've got all the flavors they're going to get. You're just waiting on them to look prettier for you. And so you might as well take those off the vine so we don't have some damage from our environment or insects. And bring them in the house. You can ripen them up or color them up a little bit quicker. If you keep the temperature around 85 degrees, they'll ripen or turn color really well. If you want to slow it down, you got too many tomatoes at one time, just keep it a little cooler, and it'll take a little while longer for them to color up.
The taste really doesn't change at that point, right?
That's right. So all the flavors get sealed off in the tomato fruit about early ripening stage. And so the mature ripening stage is when you kind of have a darker green and it goes to a little lighter green. That's a mature tomato. There'll still be a little bit of flavor compounds transferring, but once we start to see some coloring, it really severs off and would drop off if you let it, and so it's not getting any more components to make that fruit taste any better. So you might as well bring it inside and take care of it that way.
What about in terms of disease? Are we seeing any disease concerns?
Blossom end rot, which really isn't a disease, it's a calcium issue going into the fruit, which usually just those first fruit that you're really excited about. Pull those off, and your fruit, as it continues through the season, your root system develops and your stems develop, and everything's going well. So just an early season issue. We are, as the plant is doing all those things, building roots, stems, flowers, fruit, we often see a little bit decline in our resistance to disease. And septorial leaf spots are most common. Sometimes we have early blight. Sometimes we have a bacterial infection. So all those things can be going on as the plant is trying to do everything and doesn't have enough resistance to it. You can use a fungicide to spray and protect the tissue. Just read and follow label directions if that's the route you want to go. Keeping the foliage dry is always important, and so if you're doing any watering practices, we just like to water the root system. So a drip line is excellent for that. If you do use a hose, anything you're getting water on the foliage, you want that to dry out as quickly as possible. So, early morning is a good use of water situation. So those things culturally we can do. We want to keep that soil evenly moist if we can. Sometimes we get cracking in our fruit as we're ready to eat it, and that's usually a fluctuation in soil moisture. Typically we have a downpour or rain, something like that. So if that soil is already moist, it's going to be a little bit more less problem of having cracking. So if it's a real dry period and we get a deluge, then you may see cracking in your fruit.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Riley County, Gregg Eyestone. Some varieties of tomatoes are less sensitive to heat. However, the heat tolerance is only a few degrees different. For more information, contact your county extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.